So, Destry,
Yes.
it's episode 61. What are we talking about today?
I'm going to talk about the Dixie Chicks. I did a little tickler about that last time we
Yes.
recorded. And for the music part today, I'll mention the Dixie Chicks and just do a quick little story about that.
Okay. I'm going to be
What
talking
you
about.
going to talk about?
I'm going to be talking about some obscure stuff about the temple.
The temple.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. Like, how did they know God would accept the sacrifice?
That's a good question. All right.
Okay, cool. Episode 61.
We did it again. We sat here
Yeah,
for over an hour
I think so. Yeah.
being prepared, and we didn't even push record.
Yep.
Because Chris talks so dang much.
Right. And what you might what the viewer / listener might notice is that there is no video today.
No video.
Yeah, we got to the studio and there weren't any cameras,
Right.
so we're going to rectify that here pretty soon because these cameras are used by a bunch of different
people.
ministries in the
Yeah.
in the church. So we're gonna order some cameras today so we can
Right
have our
on.
own dedicated ones.
Really, this is a gift to our listeners,
Yes,
not to have to see us. But
right. Yeah,
It is going to be nice to
we
be
have a
totally
face for
independent.
radio.
Yeah, we do. No question about it. No question about it. So anyway, hey, I'm going to give my wife props right up front because she gave me feedback
Okay.
a couple of episodes ago about us naming our podcast, and she suggested putting something in there that I talk about because we
Right.
used to for the longest time we would name the Bible part of the
Yes.
podcast, and that's fine. But if I'm gonna yammer on at the beginning, we should put something in there to tag that also.
I totally agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did too. I thought that was good feedback.
So today's will be something like the Dixie Chicks and the Temple.
something like that. But we did it in number 60 also, I
Yeah.
believe, didn't we?
We did.
Music and should what was it? I don't even remember, Chris. Do you remember? What
Yeah.
was it? It was 61. Episode 61.
I thought today was episode 61.
This is 61.
Oh.
But didn't we name one?
Yes.
The music, secular music, and something or another.
Yes.
So that was that's the start of us with a different naming.
Right.
convention.
It's always evolving.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it always is. Dixie Chicks.
Yeah.
So
We've been doing a series on like kind of a deep dive into just music in
Yeah,
general.
just-
That's been your deep dive.
it's been my deep dive.
Yeah.
Because you and I will talk about music for an hour, what we like, what we don't like, the new music, the old music we listen to, and I will go through modes of listening to a handful of music artists, and it's on a spectrum that's from one extreme to another.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I brought in 2 CDs, Dixie Chicks and Led Zeppelin.
Right. All right. Well, Cowboy, take me away.
And that is, and that's an example, and that's an example of the type of music I listen to. I listened to
Right.
Stevie Wonder the other day. I've got all these CDs in my car, and it started off something that we started talking about. And I could talk about music all day. I used to talk with Kent, my buddy who passed a year and a half ago. We would talk music for hours.
Yeah.
He made music all the time. I was in a band with him for a little bit of time in high school. But anyway, so we originally, when we were talking about Dixie Chicks a couple weeks ago, I mentioned something. Our topic was do you listen to music of people that you don't agree with politically?
Right.
Should you? Do you? What's the answer? We don't have an answer for that, but my take was sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
Well, I think even if we're just talking about like hymns, I would almost guarantee that a lot of the traditional hymns that we sing in like more traditional services in church were written by people who we probably wouldn't agree with 100% theologically.
And we just don't know that
Yeah,
now
we don't
because
know
we
it.
don't have the communication like we do now.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that started a conversation about some of the extremes. people sharing their opinions, and why or why not does that affect if you listen to them or not? We talked about Liam Neeson. Now, look, I respect Liam Neeson because he's a fellow human being, but I could go the rest of my life without watching a movie of Liam Neeson. I'm sure that all the what are those movies that he did?
Taken.
The Taken. I'm sure those are very good. I haven't seen not one of them, but
I saw the first one.
You saw the first. Was it good?
Yeah,
I'm sure it's good. I'm sure he's a great actor.
Yeah, no, I mean not super believable. It's a typical action movie,
sure.
But yeah,
but
it was cool for that.
His extreme take on firearms, it just turned me off.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not his extreme take. It's his extreme take. But then I don't know if he's ever been in a movie where he hasn't shot and killed people with a firearm.
Well, he was the voice of Aslan on the Chronicles of Narnia.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. I give him props for that.
So,
but that to me, now if it was somebody like Brad Pitt, I love Brad Pitt. Mm-hmm. If he said what Liam Neeson said and then does what he does on film, I don't know. I'd probably still listen to watch Brad Pitt because I just like the way he acts. I like him, George Clooney. I like that, that whole Ocean's 11 movie. I love it. It's just fun. It's just fun.
See, I liked Oh Brother Where Art Thou?
Ocean's
absolutely.
11.
Yeah,
absolutely, great stuff. But I'm inconsistent in that. I don't have a consistent. I don't have a policy. It's just the way it is. Now, somebody like
you just enjoy a good performance, regardless of its source.
Yeah, I do. I enjoy a good performance. Speaking of which, I started being a photographer for West Florida baseball, high school baseball. Watching those kids perform is fantastic.
Right.
That's a performance that I like to see too. They're probably at their peak of performance. Many of them, right? Many of them are at their peak performance because they probably won't play college ball. Anyway, good way of putting it. I like watching good performances.
Okay.
Music, especially because it's more of an emotional thing. I saw a video last night with two guys that are almost, my goodness gracious, opposites in genres. And as always, I don't remember either one of them's name. But one of them's very poppy, and one of them is very country.
Okay.
But they did a performance together of Tennessee Whiskey. You can maybe help me with the names.
Well, I know the song.
Okay. They did a performance. My gosh, it was so powerful.
Right.
Just those two genres. Justin, not Bieber. I can't remember.
Timberlake?
Justin Timberlake. Big fan. I am a big fan of Justin Timberlake. Man, what a performer. Mm-hmm. If you've never seen an hour-long video or
are you a fan of Justin Timberlake pre-frosted tip curly hair or post-frosted?
Have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Back when he was part of, was it not NSYNC? Was it NSYNC?
So I saw a performance last night. Two people, Justin Timberlake and Chris Stapleton, do a performance of Tennessee Whiskey, a live performance. Mm-hmm. And
that's one where Justin was playing the guitar as well, wasn't he?
And singing. I think Justin Timberlake is one of the most underrated musicians, and when I say musician, I mean singer also, and performer around. I say underrated. He's one of the most famous people for doing this.
Yeah.
Perhaps underrated, what I mean is musician and just performer.
He also did a duo with Anna Kendrick, the actress. This is after they did Trolls. It was I See Your True Colors Shining Through, where he was just playing acoustic guitar and they were doing a duet, harmonizing. So cool.
You got to be good. I mean, to just sit and play an acoustic guitar and that be part of a good performance.
Right.
You've got to have talent. You know what I mean? And my understanding is just from my understanding, like I know the guy, Chris, just seeing the way he is portrayed in the media, seems like a really cool, nice guy. Mm-hmm. He's got the reputation of just walking from work, stopping and getting a bagel, talking to people, and going home and getting out and just living in the community where he lives.
Yeah.
This guy could live anywhere. He could have an entourage around him the whole time. He could afford all of that stuff. But he just seems to be a regular old guy. Mm-hmm. But I love watching him perform, and with Chris Stapleton. Chris Stapleton is known for just kind of standing there. His voice does all his talking.
Yes.
He doesn't have to do anything. He can sit on on a stool and never open his eyes, and he'd still fill stadiums. He's just so unique. But he was jumping around a little bit too, because Justin kind of was rubbing off on him a little bit. It was great. So I totally forgot why I got off on that tangent. But as far as the Dixie Chicks go, actually one of them, the lead girl, said something. And I didn't even know what it was. I think everybody knows something happened to the Dixie Chicks where they did something that was controversial. And do you even know what it was, Josh?
Well, it was during the Bush era,
It was.
George W.
It was.
And they had made some political statement that was, when Bush was president, conservatism was in, right? And there's a lot of pushback against the conservative movement, and Dixie Chicks were were part of that pushback, which was a little bit counter to the ideology of a lot of their fans, because country music is usually pretty conservative fan base,
right?
And so they said something that was critical of George W. Bush, and there's a lot of backlash from their fans about it and from the industry, and that caused a little bit of problems for them in their career.
So I think what you just said, most people would say something similar.
Yeah.
Most people say something very similar. It happened, and it would, to me, that sounds like they would have said something pretty severe.
Right.
You know what?
It wasn't severe at all, no.
She said, "We are ashamed that President Bush is from Texas."
Yeah.
We're from Texas, and we are ashamed that President Bush is from Texas. That's it.
Right.
Okay. Now, if somebody said that today, it wouldn't even be on the back cover of the worst magazine in the world, right? It would make no news.
Well, I think back then it was a lot more rare to make that type of criticism public. Nowadays, everybody says that all the time about everyone,
right,
nonstop, and so we've kind of been inundated with that kind of criticism.
Very true. It's a good point. But here's my take on this. Here's why I think it hits so hard with people. And this is another example of, I think on this podcast, Josh, you and I have talked about timing whenever we're talking to people about Christ. It's true that if you don't, we believe that it's true, if you don't believe and you're not a Christ follower, then you're going to end up not in heaven.
Right.
Right? Now, that's okay to say to somebody if you know them really well and they're seeking and they trust you and all that. But to say that in my opinion, I'm not sure about yours, but in my opinion, to say that to strangers, I think is going to push more people away than it is going to bring them closer to Christ.
Well, that's not your opener.
But in some churches, probably less than a mile from where we sit, that is somebody's opener.
Right.
Families stand on corners and scream that.
Yeah.
They're screaming verses from the Bible. The Bible says, and then they go on about it.
Right.
Now, I'm a Christ lover and I'm a Christ follower, but whenever I go by those people, I'm turned off. I'm already sold, man, and I'm turned off. But the other part of me says, I'm glad I'm not called to do that, because they are obviously called to do that. Their whole family's out there with ties, dresses. It can be 100 degrees, and that is no exaggeration. It could be 100, and they're still out there doing it.
Right.
Y'all with me? On the busiest corners of Pensacola, I remember looking at them, man, they have got to be burning hot. Their ties all the way up to the collars. You know what I mean? They're doing it.
It kind of makes you think, because part of me wants to disagree with that, but the other part, we've been here in church, we've been going through the series in the book of Jonah. That's basically what Jonah did to Nineveh.
That's right.
In the capital of Assyria. He went there, stood on a cliff, overlooked the city, and just yelled, "Punishment's coming! Turn, get right with God."
And he was called to do that, no question.
The only thing he was missing was a tie.
And
his family.
And his family. And I don't know what the temperature was.
Well, it was hot because remember God sent that gourd to give him shade.
It was hot.
Yeah.
So
he just didn't have a sign.
I bet they use that a lot, saying this is why God has called us.
Yeah.
And I want to make it clear. I admire them for that because I do believe that they are called to do that.
Yeah.
For that, I admire them.
But it's not the only tactic there is.
It's not the only tactic. And I guess if it saves one person, it was worth it. But I just, the other side of me says, man.
It doesn't imply that everyone is called to use the same, blunt tool.
That's why I'm thankful that I've never been called to do that. Because I've been called to do some things. I've been called to do things that other people wouldn't do. And I did them because I was 100% confident that I was called to do it. Timing, right?
Yeah.
Timing in place. Now, as far as the Dixie Chicks goes, I'm convinced that it's the timing of this. Now, you said that you remember that it was during a time of not a lot of people speaking out against our leadership, perhaps, right?
Or at least not as vocally.
Right, not as vocally. Here, you're right, but here's why I think it landed so badly with everybody. It was the eve, get this, Chris, it was the eve of our invasion of Afghanistan.
Okay.
It was the eve of the first, rephrase that, it was the eve of the first Gulf War. Mm-hmm. Remember on TV where we saw all those tracers and everything?
Shock and awe.
That eve.
Yeah.
They said it while that was happening.
Right.
That's bad timing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's just bad because everybody else was galvanized.
Yeah.
The whole United States was coming together. It was not long after 9/11, you know what I mean? And everybody, we just needed to be together.
It wasn't a united front.
She just said it, and Natalie Maines is lead vocalist. She said it. Emily Irwin and Marty Seidel are the other leaders of that group. Emily and Marty are sisters, and Natalie is the lead singer. Man, they're beautiful people, by the way, physically beautiful people, and they have even more beautiful voices, in my opinion.
Yep.
So talented in their voices and their musicianship, guitars, fiddles. I think one of their fathers plays slide guitar. I don't know all the. Actually, Emily played vocals, dobro, banjo, and acoustic guitar.
Yep.
Dobro's not easy to play, I understand.
Well, it's basically the acoustic version of the slide guitar. One of my favorite instruments of all time. Like Jerry Douglas, one of my favorite dobro artists ever.
Sounds so good, doesn't it? Oh,
it's
beautiful. It's
one of those instruments that you can get so much emotion out of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It bends.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And if you do it right, man, it sounds good.
Yeah, because it's played with a slide.
Right.
Yeah.
Her sister, Marty, is vocals, fiddle, and mandolin. Just those, what kind of.
I try to play the mandolin.
I know. I'd like for you to learn how to do that and come in here and play it sometime. You just hear if those instruments are in music, you get a sense without even hearing it what it could sound like. Right. And they make it. Oh man, it's so good.
I do love their style of arrangement of those things because. I grew up listening to a lot of bluegrass. I still love bluegrass, as evidenced by the fact that I attempt to play the mandolin.
Heavily influenced. This music is heavily influenced by that.
But they use it in a way that really fits the music.
Yes.
It's not just like we're going to slam away at this banjo.
Right.
And, but it complements the vocals very well.
Whenever you've got three people that can sing that way, sing the way they sing, and their voices complement each other, it's like three different instruments. It's like they have many instruments playing in one time, and they all fit each other.
Right.
It's beautiful.
By the way, related to nothing, my favorite banjo player right now, Steve Martin, the actor.
He is not bad, is he?
Yeah, he is awesome at that.
He is.
I like his group and his music.
Is him and is he out touring and everything right now?
Yep.
Man, talk about another talented person, right? Being funny and being able to play banjo and all.
I bought myself a banjo last Father's Day.
Did you?
I want to learn clawhammer style.
Sweet. Do you remember seeing? Are you old enough to remember Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
Steve Martin coming out with an arrow through his head.
Yep.
Where that was cutting edge.
Yep.
The arrow through the head was cutting edge.
And that was
So good.
that was one of his comedic routines, like outside of Saturday Night Live.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. So good. You're right. Anyway, okay, so the timing, the Dixie Chick, she was on. It was just in passing too, by the way, because the documentary that I watched about this exact topic, it was like I think it was in closing, and here's another thing, it was not on U.S. soil. They were somewhere overseas somewhere, and she said, "We are ashamed as a band that George Bush is from Texas." So it kind of, to me, it was kind of like, we're not with the United States, we're with you all. And I think that's the way most people perceived it. Now, that had such a huge influence, like you said, on country music. But the reason it had influence on country music, because it had a big influence on country music listeners.
Right.
According to this documentary, the managers of the music of the radio, it was all radio stations back then, right? Mm-hmm. We can't play Dixie Chicks,
right?
Because our listeners won't listen anymore. We'd love to play Dixie Chicks, they said, but we can't do it because people will not listen to us.
Yeah, I remember there were people publicly destroying their music.
That's exactly right.
Their cassettes and their CDs and stuff.
As if they were Marilyn Manson.
Yeah.
Or as if they were somebody who did something so egregious.
Right.
That we have to take and it was all around the United States, people putting in barrels and burning them. When I see that, I think, man, I wish I was there. I'd take every one of those CDs and I'd come home with them.
Yeah.
Now, it's easy for me to say that in retrospect.
Yeah.
But what got me, what I think got them, is that they never backed down, not 1 inch. Mm-hmm. Not the whole time. They said, screw you country music and screw you country music fans. If you don't like what we said, we have the right to say it, we'll change our genre and we'll go somewhere else and become famous. And they pretty much found a lot of fame in Canada.
Yeah.
They went to Canada and said, whatever, we'll play smaller venues, whatever. Yeah. Now, and the documentary showed the manager and them having these meetings, and they took the highlights of them. And they were, and all three of them, mostly Natalie, because she's the one that said it, would say, I'm sorry. I'm just not going to apologize. There's nothing for me to apologize for.
Right.
You know, I just said that we're ashamed, and we are.
Yeah. And
never.
Regardless of that opinion's right or wrong, you still have the right to have the opinion.
You absolutely have. And just because they're famous doesn't mean they don't have the right to say it.
Yeah. I mean, I disagreed with them, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't have said that, didn't have the right to say it.
Before I knew exactly what they said, I thought it was going to be something really bad.
Right.
I thought it was going to be something that I would agree with.
That's another thing. We have very thin skin these days.
Man, oh man.
Yeah.
And this was how many years ago? I should have known.
Early 2000s.
It was way, way long ago, technically.
Yeah.
It was.
It's like 20 years ago now.
It was unbelievable. And I just don't agree with the way that we handled it but I think, just like we were saying before, there's a time and place. If you go to a funeral, please, listeners, don't go up to the person that's grieving and say, he's in a better place. Please don't do that. I just don't think that's the right thing. If they say it, fine.
Right.
That's not helping anybody. It might help you. I just don't think that's the right thing. Just say,
don't say he's
sorry.
become an angel or he has his wings now.
Oh, my gosh. I just don't think that's the appropriate thing to say, right? So just say I love you and do something nice for him. I don't know. Just be cognizant of that.
How does that relate to this, though?
I don't know. I was trying to think. Chris, I'd like for you to cut that out because I have no idea why. It meant something, and I don't remember what it was. I don't remember what it was. A time and place.
Oh, okay.
There's a time and place.
Gotcha. Okay.
Sorry.
You don't have to cut it out.
There's a time and place.
We have no video. Chris is just sitting here like, whatever.
I know.
He's bored out of his mind.
He's on his phone. There's a time and place, and I think what the Dixie Chicks did is I think it was bad timing.
Yeah.
And I think it was a bad place because you're off soil of the United States, and it's the eve of the invasion. You know, my brother was there. Mm-hmm. I knew he was one of those. He may have been shooting one of those flares from the AC-130.
Yeah.
So I don't remember having an emotion. I don't remember hearing the thing about the Dixie Chicks. Whenever I may have had a different opinion, if I was in that fight, but I wasn't. But I think we just got carried away with them. Mm-hmm. I'm going to continue. I'm going to buy every Dixie Chick CD I can get. I admire their wherewithal to stick with it. And these two, the sisters, they said about Natalie, we'll go down with the ship. We support her and what she said. We're not going to separate. You know, because of that, we're not going to separate ourselves from her like politicians do whenever somebody's in trouble. And I admire that. I do. So I understand that I have I have retrospect, you know, to look back to use as my opinion. But even today, there's a time and place to do things and to say things, and I think they were just a part of that, unfortunately. Before I close out music, you want to say anything? Because if I had 2 cups of coffee, and I will keep going.
Well,
Chris is turning me down. I'm gonna turn you off, boy.
I think what's interesting about this, just from like looking at humanity in general, early 2000s was like there's kind of like this massive shift, just in society in general, right? You have kind of like the birth of the internet in the mid to late 90s. I mean, I know that technically the internet was around before that, but it's like kind of got a lot of people on board in the mid 90s where people were in chat rooms, and all of a sudden you have like this quasi public
AOL.
Yeah, you have like this quasi public
You've
forum
got
now
mail.
where all of a sudden, not just like it used to be the source of our news was people who were journalists who were trained and educated. Yeah, they were trained and educated in the art of dispensing news, and say what you want about the ideology behind that. It was a controlled release of information, and then we start getting the internet where everybody now is in chat rooms and they're talking to each other, and it's not just you sitting at a table over lunch with your friends. It's now you're in an environment where potentially thousands of people are all have the same volume of their voice, and then as we get into the 2000s, as the internet starts to grow, we start getting into broadband, high-speed internet access, all this stuff that catapulted into. Now it's not just a text-based dissemination of information, but now we have the ability to like instantly see videos that everybody has the ability to record and put up online. You have the advent of YouTube, all that kind of stuff. And
Yahoos
so now,
like us.
all of a sudden, everybody has the same level of exposure as everybody else.
The potential, anyway.
Yeah, and I don't think as a society we were prepared for that, because there's a tremendous amount of sources of information now, and not all of those sources are good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, all of those sources have the same amount of freedom and the same right to publish their opinions. But while we have that right and that freedom to publish our opinions, I think as a society we haven't yet developed the ability to I guess be resilient in that kind of environment. Everything is offensive. Everything is false. Everything, or it I think galvanizes people more in their opinions. Yeah, because I have an opinion. Everybody is giving their opinions. The only ones of those that are true are the ones that correspond to my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
And everybody that has an opposing opinion or even a slightly different opinion now becomes the enemy.
That's right.
That's
unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. And I think it's when you look back at history, that seems to be the cycle of humanity. Is there'll be some cultural shift, and the shift happens faster than humanity is able to accommodate it, and it results in a ton of conflict until you reach some breaking point where I guess people get fatigued from conflict, and begin to accept it, or I don't know what that mechanism is, but it's interesting to see that cycle happen throughout history. And I think the Dixie Chicks is a good indication of that. It's like this one statement that they made. It shouldn't be something that creates the kind of reaction in everybody that it did, but it did create that reaction, because I don't think people were prepared in an environment where everyone was unified against an enemy to have someone come in with an alternate view, and just be able to like roll with that.
Right.
It was like, no, you're not allowed to have the opposing view. You're supposed to go along with the groupthink.
Right. This thing got so big. Well said, Josh, by the way. Very well said. This thing got so big with the Dixie Chicks that President Bush even said, well, they have the right to say it, but they also need to be able to accept what the public has decided to do because of their right in what they've said. And that's so true.
Right.
But just the huge reaction, I guess my whole point was time and place.
Yeah.
That's it, and using that whenever we're talking to people about everything, about anything. Christ, talking about, whatever. If you want to go play pickleball, whatever. There's just certain times and places that saying the right thing, saying things are inappropriate.
And I think, too, because we have the ability to be public, it sort of, I think it makes us think that we're required to give an opinion about everything. And that's really dangerous when you don't really know all of the details. Right. The criticism would be like, what do the Dixie Chicks know about the relationship between the Muslim nations and the Jewish nations and the terrorists, like their ultimate goals for attacking countries like us, and things like that. Like that's what we were responding to, an ideology. Yeah. And and not just responding to an ideology, but an ideology that is guiding the paths of entire countries. And to have someone, and for lack of a better description, to have someone as small as the Dixie Chicks give such a broad criticism to something that is on the plates of presidents and world leaders and stuff like that. That's where the time and place is. Yeah, right. Right. Maybe there's some stuff I don't know about because I'm not in these positions to wage war against nations. Yeah. Like, that's a big decision. That's not something that we just wake up one morning and decide to do. There's entire departments of government and military that are involved in making this decision, and weighing the balances between what we're trying to accomplish versus what that effort is going to do to human lives on our side and on their side. There are innocent people that are going to be involved, yet we still make that decision. I don't think humanity is... right now, I don't think humanity is mature enough to make the kind of decisions that we used to make back in like World War II, where we had to make a decision to send an atomic bomb against an ideology that was based on ideas about master races. Because we always associate that with like Hitler. Yeah. Japan had a very similar ideology about the Japanese people. And they were using that as a foundation to impose that belief on the rest of the world, and that ideology needed to be wiped out. That was the heavy sort of decisions that we had to make as a nation. Gotcha. It's similar to that, like voicing an opinion about that. And so I understand why there is criticism. Sure. But it still doesn't take away that they had the right to take it, to make that.
Like I said about the amount of admiration I have for the family staying on the corners at 100 degrees. Right. I admire them for not backing down.
Oh, absolutely.
I admired them for
if you're going to have an opinion, stick with it.
Yeah, and hey, not 1 second. I enjoyed watching the documentary because of the way they stood. You know,
Right.
I mean, you can put yourself in their position. If you really believe something, then you need to stand by it, unless you think you were wrong.
Well, Daniel,
you know,
Daniel, and in the Bible, his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yes.
They did the exact same
That's
thing.
right.
Nebuchadnezzar was the world leader at the time.
How about it?
And they stood up and says, "I'm not going to do that."
Yep.
And but
100% believed it.
yeah,
That's what
and they didn't back down, and they accepted. Not to draw a parallel between the Dixie Chicks and Shadrach, Meshach, and
I think
Abednego.
of them every time I look at the Dixie Chicks.
Right. But they didn't back down either. Like, well, if you're going to punish me, you're going to punish me. But this
Yeah.
is what I believe, and
Yes, right. There you
I'm
go.
going to die on this hill.
It's the same principle.
Yeah.
Hey, Josh, next week,
Yes.
I'm going to talk about Led Zeppelin.
Okay.
Led Zeppelin.
All right.
I have always been a Led Zeppelin fan.
Yeah.
Hard rock. When I say rock and roll, what do you think? Buddy Holly? Do you think Elvis? Do you think Led Zeppelin? What do you think? It's kind of changed over the years. As I was growing up, Led Zeppelin to me was rock and roll.
Okay.
Okay, so let me put that out there as a baseline.
Okay.
There's many of videos and clips of Led Zeppelin that are out there that you can see. And the way that they changed things, the music that they played and had the audacity to play was totally new.
Mm-hmm.
It was totally new to the industry. And the sex symbol that Robert Plant, the lead singer, became, and the perfection of Jimmy Page, the guitar player, one of the first guys to play a guitar with a bow.
Yeah.
He did that many times, not the whole time, obviously, but many times. He was the writer. And then John Bonham, the drummer, had such a unique drumming sound, a huge bass drum. Not a lot of drums like a Neil Peart from Rush.
Yeah.
But he had just a couple, but he would bang on those things, Chris. Man, it was music. It was music to my ears.
Well, if we're going to be talking about Robert Plant next week, we're going to have to talk about his collaborations with my favorite musician, singer, Alison Krauss.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation next week.
Good. John Paul Jones played the bass.
Yeah.
And he was, most people will recognize this.
I don't recognize
You
that.
don't recognize that?
Maybe I will if I hear it.
If you've heard it, but he just does that though.
Yeah.
He has little licks like that people recognize and don't even know what's from him. I guess that's my point. But he was really, really good also. Just those four guys and Robert Plant. There's nobody that has ever sung like him or will sing like him. And for him to still be alive is a miracle in and of itself.
Yeah.
I read their book.
So we're just going into it.
We are. I read their book, and they did things like rock and roll, like you think rock and roll people did. Throw TVs out of windows and things like that, and to still be alive is unbelievable. But anyway, I'm looking forward to that, Josh.
I am too.
Thank you for listening to my two cups of coffee conversation. Chris, please cut half of it out.
No, I think it's good. But as a segue, I think it's really cool how you were focusing on the time and place aspect of this, because that really goes to what I'm talking about on the Bible part of the time and the place. And in my own sort of like weird curiosities, the stuff that I study in the Bible on my own time, I came across something that was very time and place oriented. So in the Old Testament, when sin was being addressed, the term Yom Kippur comes into play, the Day of Atonement, and that was when they had the tabernacle, when they had the temple, all this stuff. There was one day a year when sin was addressed as a nation, the Day of Atonement, and Hebrews talks about this quite a bit, but as well as like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and those, but like Leviticus 16 talks about the the process of the atonement sacrifice. The high priest, he would prepare by sacrificing a bull for his own sins, and he would kill that bull, and he would take the blood, and he would cleanse himself, like bathe first, and change into a linen garment out of his high priest garment, change into linen. He'd sacrifice this bull. He'd take the blood and he'd set it aside, and then for the sin, and that was like the atonement for his personal sins. But then they would take two goats, and they would cast lots, and they would choose. I like that. They would choose one of these two goats. One would be killed, and one would be let go. And the goat that was killed, the blood would be set aside, and the blood from the bull and the blood from the goat would be taken into the most holy place. So this is the part of the tabernacle, the part of the temple that was only accessed one time a year on the Day of the Atonement by the high priest.
By one person. Right?
By one person,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is where the presence of God dwelled. This is where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where the mercy seat was.
Wow.
So, and this all is, we've talked about this before, this whole temple, tabernacle complex was a model of the throne of God in heaven, because every time we get a vision of God in heaven, he's surrounded by this infrastructure that is like, this is the real temple where God really dwells, and these things that we're creating on earth are models of that, to remind us of what our ultimate destination is, or what our ultimate goal is, where the Creator resides. And so the tabernacle is a scaled mock-up of that. The temple is a scaled mock-up of that. And the presence of God dwelled on that seat of mercy. That was where the high priest would go into, and he would sprinkle the blood of the bull, sprinkle the blood of the goats on that mercy seat. And this was part of that atonement sacrifice. After that blood was sprinkled, because remember, sin requires death.
Yeah.
And so something innocent had to die in order to bring the balance sheet back to zero. And so once that happened, they would go back out, and the other goat that was called the scapegoat in Hebrews, is called Azazel. That's the scapegoat. The high priest would hold on to its horns, and ritually the sin of Israel would be transferred to this goat, and this goat would be sent outside the camp into the wilderness, never to be seen again. And then they would burn the other goat and the bull as like, this is the sacrifice being consumed. So what's interesting about that consuming sacrifice, when God's presence first entered the tabernacle, and then later when God's presence first entered the temple, God himself initiated a fire that was kept burning forever. It was never allowed to go out, and this was the fire that was because God, when God entered, he consumed the sacrifices. He was the one that originated the fire that consumed the sacrifices, and that fire was kept burning. It was always tended. It was never allowed to go out. So that was the fire that was used to consume these sacrifices. And there was always a physical, there's always physical evidence that God had accepted this sacrifice of atonement. One was because this fire was kept continually burning, but also, when the high priest went into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, if there had been any sin in him, he wouldn't survive that encounter. That's why they would physically tie ropes to his leg. Yeah. They'd put bells on the hem of his garment. So if
just
the bell stopped ringing,
you're not telling us.
Yeah, if the bell stopped ringing, we know to start pulling on that rope because you're dead. Because we can't go in there and get you. So we got to have a way of, So when you go behind that veil between the, all that stuff.
You reckon he was nervous?
Oh, I would absolutely be nervous.
Do something that I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
Is there a sin that I didn't atone for?
Right. Especially because Moses at one time prayed forgive us for the sins that we've done, and even for the sins that we don't realize that we've done. So I remember as a kid reading that and thinking, oh, no.
Yes, right.
And I've shared that part of my testimony before.
Yep. You didn't like going to sleep.
I didn't, because I thought, that was something that would result in me losing my salvation.
Yeah.
Because that was before I understood that salvation can be lost.
Right.
Anyway,
sorry.
yeah, that's a whole rabbit trail in of itself. But anyway, so my point is there's physical evidence that this sacrifice had been accepted because God's presence was there and because the temple existed. That was all in place. So fast forward a little bit. This is the time right at the Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar. He conquers the southern kingdom of Judah. This is during the time of Daniel. This is during the time of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all those guys who are kind of concurrent with each other. And Ezekiel.
Got it. I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
I tried to silence things, and what do? I screwed up.
Well, no, it's a good alarm because we tend to go long. But so Ezekiel brought some clarification because all of a sudden God's presence left the Solomon's first temple. This was shortly before Nebuchadnezzar and his army came and destroyed it. And he answered the question, why did God leave? And the reason was because the southern kingdom of Judah, as they got more and more into idolatry, started erecting statues of pagan idols in the temple itself and worshiping those idols in the temple where the presence of God was supposed to dwell.
And stuff in their lockers too, right?
Yep, they're putting stuff in their lockers. Yeah, bringing their idols from home so they can, the priest would come and do the temple stuff, but they would have their own idols so they could worship them, at the same time because they were. Oh, absolutely! Like the audacity of these people. But we do the same thing.
Yeah, I know. You're absolutely right. I was thinking the same thing.
I mean, we just had Super Bowl Sunday last year. Last week.
Mm-hmm.
How many people stayed home instead of going to church?
That's true. That's true. That's very true. That's a great reminder.
How many of us wore our jerseys to church?
Yeah.
We brought our idols to our locker. Just kidding.
I wore an idol. I wore a Tar Heel jersey.
I didn't mean to imply that we're a church full of idol worshipers.
No, you're absolutely right.
Chris is looking at me because I deleted one of his comments on our Facebook page that basically did the same thing. Sorry.
That's funny. That is a great reminder, though, that we are those people.
Yeah,
we are,
absolutely.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
Just nobody's writing about us.
Right. We just have to be careful that we don't do the same thing.
Right.
Anyway, so the question is, and then shortly after that, after God's presence left that first Solomon's temple, the temple got destroyed.
Yeah.
There was also a time during the tabernacle, during the book of Judges, where the Philistines attacked Israel, took the Ark of the Covenant away from the temple, and God's presence left. And so there's probably about a century there where God's presence wasn't in the tabernacle either. So, so that presents a dilemma. Like, if God's presence isn't there, if that fire has gone out, how do we know that the atonement sacrifice worked? How do we know that our sin had been atoned for?
Yeah.
And and then, after the first temple got destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, there was no temple. And so how do you even do the atonement sacrifice at all? Mm-hmm. Now, during the reign of Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great in the Persian Empire, he gave Israel permission to go back and start rebuilding the temple and rebuilding Jerusalem. And that's what we read about in books of Ezra, Nehemiah. Those are like the histories of them coming back and starting to rebuild all that stuff. And that's the second temple. And when they started building the second temple, there was nowhere near the magnificence and the splendor that existed in the first temple that Solomon built. It was kind of like, well, we have something that meets the criteria of being the temple. We have a place to now do those sacrifices. But there's some really important parts of this temple that aren't here.
Let's leave out the lockers this time.
Yeah, right.
So there's no place to hide the idols.
The presence of God never dwelled in that second temple, and this was the temple that existed during Jesus' time, because it lasted all the way from when they started building it during the Persian Empire. This was the temple that existed all the way from there into the 1st century AD under the Roman Empire. So it survived the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, Roman Empire, all the conflicts, in between there. All that stuff was in, that temple was there. God never was. Not only that, but the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat never were in the most holy place either. So you have an empty Holy of Holies, an empty most holy place. But
you had a tent.
Yeah. Well, it was a solid building, but
Okay.
but it was empty inside.
Okay.
You had most of the pieces of furniture and stuff that were in there, but it was nowhere near its former glory. God wasn't there. Ark of the Covenant, mercy seat wasn't there. So each year on the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice was being made. The blood of the bull and the goats were sprinkled in the room. The scapegoat was still, sent off into the wilderness, but they really had no way of knowing that their sins had been atoned for the way they used to. And so we get into the New Testament, and another significant event happens. Well, a couple. One was the birth of the Messiah, God dwelling with us in the flesh.
Saying that's a significant event is highly underselling that.
It is,
I would say, but
also but also saying that is a significant event is a very Christian thing to say, not necessarily a very Jewish thing to say, because from the Jewish perspective, it wasn't significant at all, because they didn't believe that he was the Messiah.
Right.
And that plays into this whole thing.
Okay.
So, AD 65 ish, we have the book of Hebrews, which is mind blowing because it kind of decodes the whole Old Testament. It talks about those sacrifices, how there was nothing final about those sacrifices. They were just a picture of something. Okay. And he even solidifies that logically. He's like, if these sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament that we're commanded to do, if they were final, why do we have to keep doing them every year? At most they were good for a year. Then we had to redo them again.
Good point.
And he says, but there was a sacrifice that was final. And that's his presentation of Christ. And the whole book of Hebrews is him saying, Christ is superior to all of the stuff we read in the Old Testament. Not only was he superior to it, but he fulfilled all of the laws of the Old Testament when we couldn't. And in proving his superiority, he talked about, in the Old Testament we have, God used to talk to us by angels, he used to talk to us by prophets. But Christ is superior to both of those, and he lays out why that is. He says in the Old Testament, we used to have leaders like Moses, Joshua. Christ is superior to those, and he lays out the reasons why. He says in the Old Testament, we used to have a temple with priests that were from the tribe of Levi. He says Jesus is our high priest from the tribe of Judah, and he lays out why that's superior to the priesthood of the Levites in the Old Testament. So he goes through all of the pillars of Judaism. He goes through them one by one and says Christ is superior to this, he's superior to this, he's superior to everything. Not only is he superior to everything, but as God in the flesh, he sacrificed himself on behalf of our sin, and was that final sacrifice that no longer requires the sacrifice of bulls and goats anymore. He was the final sacrifice. And so the timing of that was extremely beneficial, because what it established is that all of that stuff in the Old Testament, the sacrifices, the temple, all those processes, they were just pictures of the true thing that was going to happen, Christ. And so there's really no need for those anymore. And the reason the timing of that was really good is because just a couple of years later, AD 70, under Emperor Vespasian in the Roman Empire, the Romans came and destroyed the Second Temple, and there hasn't been a temple for 2,000 years since. And so there's two questions that come from that. How do we atone for our sins now?
Right.
And when we do atone for those sins, how do we know that atonement was successful?
Ooh.
And so you kind of have humanity splitting into two different directions. Yeah. We have the path of Hebrews that says, well, Christ is the reason that works now, because he was the final sacrifice, and there's no need for the temple. There's no need for the sacrifices anymore. But then you have, but that's a messianic view. That's the foundation on which the church was built.
Right.
You have the non-messianic view, which is like Orthodox Judaism. The Pharisees still didn't believe that Christ was the Son of God, that his death was the final atonement for all. They were still looking at the Old Testament law and sacrifices and stuff, and they were in a really hard, unsolvable dilemma, which was, how do we even do atonement if there's no sacrifice, if there's no temple, if there's, and so where we have the writings of the early church fathers, we have the writings of the New Testament, all that stuff, the Orthodox Jews didn't have that. They did something else instead. First century, we're developing the church. First and second, third centuries, they're developing Judaism. What does Judaism look like without a temple? What does Judaism look like without our inherited land? What does the law look like in an environment where we don't have the elements that are required for us to keep the law? And so they started writing a separate work called the Mishnah, which was how to reinterpret the Old Testament law in light of there not being a temple, there not being a land that we occupy, right. Nothing like that. And then there's another work in parallel to that called the Talmud. So the Mishnah was reinterpreting the law. The Talmud was the ongoing debate amongst the head rabbis of the day, and it's an ongoing document. It's like an ongoing debate about that, of how to reinterpret the laws based on how the world is now. And so part of this is going back through the Old Testament saying, okay, what is Yom Kippur now? What is the Day of Atonement now? And the Mishnah is like reinterpreting the law in light of that. The Talmud is the ongoing debate, but it's also the record of what this debate has looked like for the past 2,000 years. And when you get to Yom Kippur, it's really interesting because they talk about how they knew the sacrifice was accepted during the time of the temple when God's presence wasn't there, like during the time of the Second Temple especially. And they talk about a verse from Isaiah, I believe it's Isaiah 118, where it says, though your sins be as scarlet, they'll be whiter than snow. Their sins be like crimson, they'll be like wool. What they would do is they would take a scarlet cord and they would tie it to the scapegoat. And according to the Mishnah was like written down, the oral tradition that had been passed down from generations through of the Jews. And according to this tradition, when the presence of God wasn't there to give that direct indication that the sacrifice had been accepted, this was in its place, where they would tie this scarlet cord to the goat, send it off in the wilderness. It would turn white because of that verse. Though your sins be as scarlet, they'll be white as snow. And that was their indication that the goat had made it to the wilderness, that the atonement sacrifice was complete and had been accepted. And which, kind of solved this problem of how do we know that the atonement sacrifice worked, but it still required a temple. Well, in the Talmud, as they're recording the debate between this, they made an observation. This is specifically in, I have this reference here on my phone, So Talmud Yoma 39b.5.
Wow.
So Yoma comes from that word like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This was the part of the Talmud that talks about this specific or this specific day in Hebrew history. How do we accomplish that now? And the debate around it. And I'll read it here. It said this. The sages taught during the tenure of Shimon HaTzadik, the lot for God always arose in the high priest's right hand. After his death, it occurred only occasionally. But during the 40 years prior to the destruction of the second temple, the lot for God did not arise in the high priest's right hand at all. So too, the strip of crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent to Azazel did not turn white, and the westernmost lamp of the candelabrum did not burn continually. What did that say? It said there was a time before the destruction of the temple. It said about 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the crimson cord stopped turning white. That's a really, really interesting timeline, because what happened 40 years before the destruction of the temple? If the temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, that means 40 years before that was AD 30. That's a significant date to us as Messianic believers, Christians, because AD 30 was the death of Christ. So it's interesting in this whole debate about, what do sacrifices look like now, and their recalling of this oral tradition, this memory of what used to happen. They said, we used to know that the sacrifice was accepted because this crimson cord would turn white. But for some reason, during the last 40 years of the temple's existence, for some reason that stopped happening. We don't know why, but it just stopped happening.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah,
how that corresponds?
I thought you were saying AD 30. You're saying AD 30.
Anno Domini, yeah.
AD 30. Okay,
yeah.
Gotcha now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Wow. That's.
Isn't that,
we know why, but
yeah.
they wouldn't have known.
The other thing they mention is they said also the doors of the sanctuary opened by themselves as a sign that they would soon be opened by enemies. So they're referring to Jeremiah's prophecy in the Old Testament that said the temple would one day be destroyed. And so the same time that the crimson cord stopped turning white, also the temple doors opened by themselves. And that was kind of an impossible task, because these doors were like 30 feet tall. It took several men. It was like a 3-story tall building, but that was a door. These things weighed tons.
That's the kind of thing I have on my house, Chris. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've been over there or not. Front doors like that.
Right? Yeah. But it took several men to open these, and they just opened by themselves. The way they explained it is, this was a sign that the temple was opening to the enemies that would one day destroy it. We know that that this sign was because now there is no barrier between the most holy place and the rest of the world. Jesus paid that sacrifice for us.
It's like the curtain ripping.
Right. Exactly. And so I think this is something I've been looking into recently, reading through these, how the old laws were being interpreted. And I ran across this. And I'm like, well, that is really interesting.
That is interesting.
There was a physical stop to how sacrifices were done. And it confused everybody who didn't read Hebrews.
You just answered a question I didn't even know I had.
Yeah.
Like how did we know?
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Very interesting, Josh.
I think it's really cool.
That's fantastic. You did a great job. I appreciate you doing that. You laid out a history that was easy to follow.
Cool.
That was really good. Really good. I appreciate that. Buddy, we're at right at an hour.
Oh, wow.
Just a little over an hour. And I it's my fault. I ramble on. Man, that's the way I do it.
There's no specification that says we have to only go an hour.
All right. So, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that pretty much encapsulates it.
I think it does. That's great, man. Thank you so much, Josh. Appreciate that. Next week, I'm going to talk about Led Zeppelin, like I said, and come on back and we'll listen. Chris, thanks for being here. appreciate you. Thank you, Josh, and our listeners. Viewers not applicable today, but we'll see everybody next week.
Yep.
Thanks.
Bye.